We will now welcome our final speaker of the night, Dr. Alan Mendoza, who is the co-founder and executive director of the Henry Jackson Society, which advocates the view that supporting and promoting liberal democracy should be an integral part of Western foreign policy. He studied for a BA, MPhil, and then PhD at Gonville and Keyes College, examining Anglo-American relations during the Bosnian War. Dr. Mendoza, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Mr. President, for such a warm welcome. I have to say, he's very well behaved up there, and he chairs these meetings very well. In fact, everyone's been very well behaved today, because it could have turned into quite a battle royale. But I want to thank the speakers on both sides, actually, and from the audience, for having contributed, I think, to the seriousness within which we ought to reflect upon a debate, which ultimately encompasses, firstly, the concept of military interventionism, but of course, all that which stems from it as well. And I was struck, of course, listening with interest, as I always do, to Sir Malcolm and his great experience in diplomatic and foreign policy, and to hear the side that he had come onto in this debate. And he almost convinced me. I was almost going to join him in that empty seat over there on that side. Almost. But I feel he overextended his argument. And let me explain why I think that it's actually the opposition side that, on balance, should win this debate. And the reason I'd like to say that is Sir Malcolm went through a very great litany of successful and unsuccessful interventions, looking at the historical side of it. But as my colleague pointed out, it's only one side of it to look at the past. If you're going to start judging the past just on the past as it happens, you simply run the risk of not considering the alternate futures, the alternate realities that would have existed had we not intervened in those places. And that's something you have to balance up in this debate, not in some macabre look at body counts and what was worse, but just the concept of what was behind that. And it's worth looking at a couple of interventions in particular that may have gone wrong in certain cases, but which we need to understand why we went in, to understand again why it was relevant to go in, and why, if the choice happened again, we would need to consider very seriously, regardless of the mistakes of the past, whether we should do the same again. The first one is Libya. Do you remember why we went into Libya? It had nothing to do with oil, it had nothing to do with US prestige. In fact, if you remember, the Americans didn't want to be involved in Libya at all. It was, Barack Obama's famous position of leading from behind. That was the line the Americans used in that. It was, in a sense, pushed forward because a group of concerned nations, amongst which we were one of the prime leaders, together with the French, felt that there was something called the responsibility to protect that needed to be brought to the fore in the ideals of foreign policy and international security. And if you look back on what the responsibility to protect is, it's a UN concept put forward to suggest that when a government either no longer controls its territory and acts of genocide are occurring on it, or worse, is complicit in those acts of genocide, we, the international community, but let's be frank, it's not going to be the Russians or the Chinese, is it? It's going to be the West who are going to contribute the bulk of forces, have a responsibility, and a legal one, to intervene and stop the genocide from occurring. And what happened in Libya? Why did we go in? We went in because Muammar Gaddafi, as brutal a dictator as you'll have seen in the world over time, was going to extend his brutality. During the Arab Spring, you saw rebellion in the eastern part of Libya, in Benghazi, other places. Rather than come to terms with reform and the need for his regime to go, Gaddafi chose the military option. And he went publicly on radio and literally said he was going to go house to house and kill every opposition person to him in Libya. In fact, he was essentially saying, I'm going to commit a genocide. We went in to stop that genocide. And yes, it's certainly true that Libya today is not perfect. There are many problems there. But did we stop Gaddafi's genocide? Yes, we did. If we look again at other examples, we intervened in Kosovo. Malcolm used it as a negative, saying, well, Kosovo became independent. But we went in there to stop the ethnic cleansing of the Kosovo Albanians by the Serbs under Milosevic. And we succeeded in doing that. Yes, there were unintended consequences. I agree with that basis. No one is suggesting that all interventions are good and that there are not unintended consequences there. But did we succeed in the noble goal of stopping bloodshed? Yes, we did earlier. You mentioned Bosnia. Malcolm was the Foreign Secretary at the end of Bosnia, when we did finally intervene, after years of non-intervening, when 8,000 Bosnian Muslims were taken out in Srebrenica on this continent in 1995 and murdered because of who they were, Bosnian Muslims. And we had allowed that situation to occur over a period of time by not intervening. Every time the Bosnian Serbs committed an atrocity, we ummed and ahed. We thought, should we, shouldn't we? The end result of that was mass murder on the European continent 40 years after we said, 50 years after we said it would never happen again on our soil. And then we went in, the war was over within a matter of weeks. Again, Bosnia is not perfect today. If you look at what's happened, there are many political problems. But is it better than Srebrenica? Absolutely, in that case. So you've got to consider what would have happened had we not gone in and the costs of that when you're debating and considering this very difficult issue. And the other matter you have to consider is, look at the notion of Western intervention. This doesn't occur in a vacuum. We're not the only interveners in the world. If you look at, again, some of the worst examples of, if you like, Western intervention, Iraq, for example, other countries were intervening in Iraq as well. Iran was mentioned. We've had other cases in Syria. Okay, we were only intervening on the ISIS side of the debate, but Russia rushed in to fill the vacuum that our non-intervention didn't succeed in. Pulling back from the idea of Western intervention doesn't mean the world is going to be a happier place. It just means you've got the ability for China, Russia to come in and do what they want with no controls. Yes, there were atrocities in Iraq, disgraceful atrocities, but the people who did them were brought to book by our systems of justice in that. That never happens in Russia. That never happens in China. I think it's quite telling that in the recent debate, when the Iraqi government was considering kicking the Americans out of Iraq because of the Soleimani strike, which country dashed in to say, don't worry, we'll come and guarantee your security? It was China. China made the offer. That is not a future I think the Cambridge Union wants to endorse. The idea that pulling back from Western interventionism should therefore lead to people with no interest in human rights, no interest in defending the international order, coming and replacing us there. Because we ought to consider that the two types of interventionism, I think this maybe go to your point about what is harmful and good in interventionism. Why do interventions occur? Interventions occur either because of an international security issue, or a national security issue if it's a more minor concern, when you're trying to enforce the rules-based international order, okay, you want to make an attempt. And again, for all that Iraq went wrong, the reason given for the Iraq War was not to create a new Iraqi state, but the reason given was that Saddam Hussein was not complying with the international regulations on chemical weapons and on nuclear weapons. So the idea was he was not actually complying. You need an enforcement mechanism. You also need that enforcement mechanism when people are dying out there. And let's be frank about it. I won't thank you. Let's be frank about it in a moment. Let's be frank about it. It's the West that is the only set of nations who are going to do this, because most of the time, other powerful countries in other parts of the world side with the oppressors and not the oppressed. Yes, sir. You, yes. Oh.
I think that the opposition have quite relied upon all this counterfactual history, that if you say that Western intervention is bad, and you look at if Western intervention didn't happen at all, and that's oh so bad, therefore you oppose the motion. However, I don't think that's a good way to look at it. For example, if you went on a night out and had 10 pints of beer, and you were vomiting and you were hungover and you had a really bad time, and if you hadn't gone out, if you'd gone out and not drink any beer at all, and you were, because alcohol acts as a social lubricant, you're quite socially awkward. Both of those situations are bad, but that does not necessarily mean that that you can necessarily say, because Western intervention, excluding that is bad, that means that the proposition is false. I know it's a bit of a stretch, the analogy, but I was trying to come up with one on the spot, and that's one that came to me. But I just think this counterfactual basis to your arguments that all three of you used is not a good way to look at this situation.
Sir, I don't wish to pass comment on your social life. But I'd ask you for a moment to consider this as a leader of a country for one moment, rather than a Cambridge student going out on, night on the tiles in Cindy's or whatever is left here in Cambridge these days. Leaders face difficult decisions. They have to consider the counterfactuals. They have to consider what happens if we don't intervene as much as we do intervene. What we know is that non-intervention is a choice, and it has consequences as well. You can't say, oh, I didn't intervene in that in Syria, therefore I'm not responsible for Assad's use of chemical weapons or of the mass refugees fleeing from his evil rule that went to Europe and such like. You are partly responsible. You chose not to do anything about it. You have to live with those consequences as well. And that is what leaders have to do at all times. And I'm going to end, because we're heading in this moment, with a final thought. We're in the final minute, where we've got to consider what you as a union vote tonight, how that impacts going forward. So there's a common consensus to say, well, it's just a debating union, what does it matter? In 1933, the Oxford Union passed a motion saying this House would not fight for king and country. And you all go, it's just a debating union debate. But actually it wasn't. It was resonant of a broader mood within the country about not using force, about stepping back from cases where you might need to intervene, where you might need to do something. And that had an impact far beyond these walls. Tonight, when you consider the vote you are going to cast in a few moments, I'd urge you to pass through the no side, because if you don't, the message you are fundamentally sending is the message that Dawn actually put it out. She said, we couldn't intervene in Syria because of the overhang of Iraq, and we felt we couldn't do it in that way. What overhang does your vote tonight have? If we come out of this debate saying that on balance, despite the problems, and we've said in this way that we should not be intervening in the future, which is what you'll be saying if you say it's more harm than good, how can we as a country ever intervene, ever, anywhere again? It's not possible to do that from a moral or from a logical perspective. So instead, I'd urge you to consider your vote carefully. Think about the messaging of what you're saying. Accept that yes, there have been problems with interventions in the past, but to take the idealist stance and to say that our tomorrows can be better than our todays, but only if we accept the notion that we, as a union, as Cambridge students, the educational elite of the UK, believe that fundamentally there is still a role for us to play in enforcing international standards and in keeping people safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, for that bold summation of the motion. In this House, we vote with our feet. That is to say that how you walk out of this chamber tonight will affect what results I announce in the bar in about 15 minutes. If you agree with the proposition, walk through the aye door, with the opposition through the noes door, and if you're still unsure, walk right through the middle into the abstention lobby. We have calculated a pre-vote before this debate, so we will also be announcing the swing as well as the final result. I'd like to make some thank yous. Thanks to our guest speakers tonight for participating in this debate. Thanks especially to Iman, our executive officer, who has played a major part in putting this debate together. And I would like to thank all of you for being here tonight for the first debate of Lent and the 2020s. Have a wonderful term, have a wonderful year, have a wonderful decade. Good night.